Well, good evening, everybody. I really want to respect tonight. Tonight is really about us coming together, learning more about the specificity of the plans, and weighing in. We all care about our town. We all want it to be the safest, most successful place. And I think, there's been a lot of conversation, a lot of recent conversation since 2011. It's time for action. I really appreciate everyone being here tonight. I appreciate everyone being so fully engaged, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions and for everyone just being able to have a productive community conversation. I'd also like to, for brief remarks, bring up my former county council colleague and your champion on the House of Delegates side, Courtney Watson.
Good evening, everyone. I'll just be very brief. I am now in the House of Delegates, and along with Senator Katie Hester, who's over here on the left side, we worked hard in Annapolis to bring state funding to Ellicott City. We were successful. We have a pot of $11 million that we are able to access for Ellicott City of state funding. I will be here, and Senator Hester will be here if you want to ask any questions about how the state funding works. And what we are doing is we're doing everything we can to bring resources to you, not just this past legislative session, but every year into the future. How much more can we bring to Ellicott City to help with these retention projects? So I'll be here if you have any questions. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for being here. I'm Katie Hester, your state representative in the Senate in Annapolis. I just want to say it's really great to be back home after 90 days in Annapolis. It's great to be here, and I was down in Ellicott City today. I want to thank the county executive for making this an inclusive and transparent process, and I know that public safety has been his #1 priority, and so I really want to underscore that, and I'm looking forward to looking at all, 5 options, which now include the tunnels from that public safety lens. I also want to say that, we've been, here in Ellicott City, we've worked really hard, and we're now at a point where we can charter, the city does not need to be defined by the floods, right? We'll pick a plan, we'll move forward, and then we've been the first for so many things. The first road, the first railroad, the first national park. And whether we become the next big tourist attraction, the next center hub for innovation, that's really up to us. So we're a passionate team, and I look forward to lively debate, and just very much look forward to what comes next. What is our next first here in Ellicott City? Thank you.
Well, good news, we're already ahead of schedule. My name is Scott Peterson. I'm the Director of Communications, and I'm going to be your MC tonight, as well as I'm going to be the timekeeper and taskmaster to try to make sure we get through everything that we need to do as quickly as possible. I want to take a moment to acknowledge all the elected officials and the representatives that are here today. Obviously, Delegate Watson, Senator Fry Hester, who you heard from. Also want to acknowledge Senator Lamb, Delegate Ebersol. We have Regina Clay, representing Congressman Cummings' office. Obi Chimere, representing Senator Van Hollen's office. Mary Catherine Cochran, representing Delegate Terry Hill. And Karina Fisher, representing Councilmember Liz Walsh's office. We'd also like to recognize former council member John Weinstein and former county executive Alan Kittleman. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us. So our agenda tonight, the next part is we're going to get an overview of the flood mitigation plans. And then after that overview of the flood mitigation plans, we're then going to go to an explanation of the Section 106 process. And then, as you noticed coming in, there was various stations that were out there that cover flood mitigation plans, high ground access, buildings, and the master plan. We created these breakout sessions to give everyone the opportunity to talk directly to the experts and to try to mitigate all the questions that we can and that you may have directly to our experts. And then, as we spend time letting everyone go around those breakout session areas, we're going to bring everyone back here for public comment and a Q&A with the county executive and the experts that are from the government to hopefully answer your questions. We are going to do our best. We have a packed house tonight, and again, we have that 9 o'clock deadline, so we are going to be asking, and I'm sorry if I'm going to be a little annoying, that everyone keep their question and answer to 2 minutes so we can get through as many as possible. So please think of your neighbors and everyone else here and try to limit your comments, questions to under 2 minutes, and I will be next to you trying to nudge you along so we can try to get through as many as possible. So without further ado, let me introduce Mark DeLuca and McCormick and Taylor for an overview of the flood mitigation plan. Thank you so much.
So for those of you that haven't met me or don't know me, I'm Mark DeLuca. I work for the Department of Public Works. And what I wanted to do is just kind of preface what Chris Brooks from McCormick Taylor will be discussing in a little bit more depth. We developed many more scenarios after the last 5-year plan. So, and what you'll see tonight is probably the narrowing down of all the other iterations we've done of the modeling run, the hydraulic run. And 5 were selected, and you will see them in a little bit more detail tonight. So without any other delay, I want to get right into Chris giving some explanation of the models.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, so many of you may know me from previous presentations. I've been involved with studying the flooding in Ellicott City since prior to the 2016 flood event. Many of the components, the individual components of the 5 plans we're going to talk about tonight may be familiar to you. The shorthand, if it's not, we can certainly handle that in the breakout sessions and answer your detailed questions about that. So we're going to jump right into it. Since early this year, we have done several dozen iterations, different combinations of storage ponds, conveyance improvements, tunnels, things like that. What you're seeing here tonight will be the 5 chosen combinations that resulted out of those several dozen iterations. So start a little bit about what the previous plan from 2018 included. For stormwater, it included the Quaker Mill and the H7 pond, which is up in the Hudson branch by 29 and 40. The conveyance projects included the modification of Lower Main Street and the removal of 10 buildings to increase the floodplain, the Maryland Ave culverts, which we'll talk about in some more detail, West End roadway crossing expansions and floodplain grading, as well as the Lot D channel expansion, which expanded the channel and the conveyance under Main Street from Court Avenue down through Lot D. So the first of the 5 options that are currently on the table is option 3F5. And again, we had many options, so there was a numbering system used for those. You'll see that we have the T1 pond, which is in the Tiber. That's the largest of all the ponds, as well as the H7 and Quaker Mill pond. In addition, the most notable addition to this particular option is the underground storage. The underground storage are significantly sized underground vaults or underground pipe farms, which include Lot F at West End, as well as the BGE right-of-way along US 29 and 40. In addition, for conveyance, the floodplain modification for this option only includes the removal of 4 buildings, which are the ones immediately upstream from Maryland Avenue, the 2 10-foot Maryland Ave culverts, which will help the pinch point of water trying to get through Lower Main Street to the Patapsco, the previously mentioned West End roadway crossing work, as well as the Lot D channel expansion. So that's 3F5. So the next option on the table, 3G5, what you'll note as far as the last slide goes is this does not include any of the underground storage options. It does, however, add NC3, which is a pond in the New Cut subwatershed, which was not in the previous iteration. And then again, you're seeing the same conveyance project improvements. There are 2 additional buildings removed for floodplain grading as part of this option as well. Third option, 3G6, very similar to 3G5. However, there is an additional pond added in the Hudson, the H4 pond. And also, we're back to the removal of only 4 buildings. And maybe most notable is that the going through Lot D, that channel expansion is not included in this option. So 3G7 is the 4th option, which includes the ponds that were mentioned in the previous iteration. Again, we don't have the Lot D expansion here, but what we do have in addition to the previous is the North Tunnel. Now, that would be a tunnel that starts in the vicinity of Court Avenue and carries water from the Hudson branch all the way to the Patapsco River underneath. And then our last option, 3G8, which is very similar to 3G7, but in addition to the North Tunnel, also includes a South Tunnel option, which would carry water at the confluence of the Tiber Hudson and New Cut, which is essentially the area behind Kaplan's, and carry that water directly into the Patapsco south of the current Tiber River. So again, it's a little hard to follow. There's a lot of components to each of these. Hopefully you can see how they differ from one to the other. I'm going to show you a little bit how they differ in terms of time, cost, and effectiveness. Mark would like to speak here.
So I should have set some context to how these 5 scenarios actually came about, and because the goals of the new iterations that we were running were slightly different than the goals that we were working under the first time around. And so what we're trying to accomplish here primarily is to save as many of the historic structures as possible, and also reduce water on Lower Main Street to an absolute minimum, the minimum that we could get in the model. And they're the two main points that provide some context to this analysis that weren't necessarily so in the last one. We were trying to reduce water and improve public safety in the last one, but the direction here was to not to think about or not to be restrained by anything, just try to save as many historic structures as possible and get the lowest elevation of water on Main Street. And so now when you take a look at it, without the constraint of money and with only a partial constraint on time. Okay, so now when you take a look at it, with that context, I think it might be a little bit more clear why these particular options were chosen.
Thank you, Mark. So up on the screen, you can see a comparison of both the cost, the approximate time for construction, the improvement in the max depth of flooding using the July 2016 storm as a benchmark, as well as average velocity through Lower Main Street. A couple of notable things about this table. One, of course, you can see that with increasing effectiveness comes increasing cost and time, which is understandable. I think one number that might jump out at some folks, the average velocity for 3G6 is higher than many of the other alternatives. That's because the first 2 alternatives have the channel at Lot D expansion, which keeps the water in the channel and not pushes it out onto Main Street. The last 2 options have the tunnels, which also have that effect. So 3G6 in the middle is one that has the most water that is not kept in the channel, and therefore the velocities are a little higher. You'll also notice that that is among the lowest and quickest of the alternatives. So again, with increasing effectiveness comes increasing time and cost. So one of the things we wanted to take a closer look at, because of the proposed removal of the buildings near Maryland Avenue, was how this might affect hydraulically the historic B&O museum buildings. So you can see this is an existing, from the July 16 flood, existing flood depth map, and you can see the B&O is the building, the large, long building most off to the right side, near the end there. Yeah, so. Right there. So between the 5 alternatives, this alternative, which has the highest depths of the 5 proposed options, 3G6, one thing you'll note is there is a significant decrease in the flood elevation along the face of the B&O Museum building, and I'll toggle that back and forth just so you can see the 4 to 6 feet and 2 to 4, and then that goes to a max of 2 to 4, and then down to only 1 as you get there. So under this scenario, there would be an improvement in the flood elevations in front of the museum. You can also see the alignment of the 2 Maryland Avenue culverts in this graphic right here. We also looked at the velocity, because the concern, again, was with the removal of those buildings, does the water then blast straight on towards the B&O Museum buildings? Again, we're off right here at the edge. It's a little hard to see. You can see those yellow and orange representing the higher double-digit velocities. With the proposed, and again, this is with the highest velocity out of the 5 proposed options, what you can see now in front of that building is that mostly blue color, which represents lower velocities in the 2 to 5 feet per second range. So through this two-dimensional analysis, we can show that even with the removal of the buildings, the installation of the Maryland Ave culverts and other improvements will result in significant lowering of velocities and flood depth along the B&O Museum and not have an adverse effect on that historic structure. So just another way of looking at that here, you can see again, this is our existing floodplain map from 2016. So we're going to take, that arrow represents sort of our visual direction that we're looking here. And one of the things I want to point out, we're going to look at the flood depth comparison around the B&O. This is actually an area that has what I'll say is the least dramatic visually decrease in flood depths. If we were to turn around from this spot and look up the street, what you would see as a result of these 5 options is the flood depth being cut in half or even 2/3 less than it was in 2016. Because the floodplain spreads out here, as you approach Maryland Ave, this bottleneck widens out into Maryland Ave. The effect is a little less dramatic. So this would be a representation of the existing floodwaters in the July 2016 event. You can see up into the windows of the buildings, certainly near the tops of the cars. Now, among the 5 options, the least effective option, in terms of reducing flood depth would bring it down to, if you look along the left there, you can see the bottoms of the store windows, within 3 feet, where your flood proofing has more effectiveness. If we look at the lowest depth of the 5 options, again, you're bringing it down even further, where you've just got a little bit in the doorways and along the buildings. The cars, it doesn't really extend very far up Maryland Avenue. So again, just to give you an idea, in terms of the effect on that particular property, the decreases that would be seen. So again, that's a relatively brief depiction of the 5 options and also a little bit about how that particular historic property would be affected or improved. I know we're going to have a lot of time for questions, both in the breakout sessions as well as afterward. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Virginia Bailey to discuss the Section 106 process for the project.
Good evening. So I am going to give you a very brief 10-minute overview of the Section 106 process. So Section 106 comes from the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. This act established that federal agencies have to act as responsible stewards of the nation's historical and cultural resources. This came at a time that was during when the interstate system had come through the country. There was a lot of urban redevelopment going on, and as a result of a lot of loss of historic structures nationwide, this law was passed in order to protect them so that federal agencies have to consider their effects. It created the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, the ACHP, which is an independent federal agency that oversees and promotes the protection, preservation of historic resources. Additionally, that the ACHP advises the President and Congress on historic preservation issues. It also created the National Register of Historic Places, and we'll talk about that a lot during my session here, as well as the State Historic Preservation Office. Every state has one designated. In Maryland, it's the Maryland Historic Trust. And it also created what we call the Section 106 process. This is the overview. This is a graphic that actually comes right from the Advisory Council's website. And we'll go through each of these steps, but it is truly a process. Every federal agency that has an action, an undertaking, whether it be financial with money, whether it be an approval that they have to make, has to follow the Section 106 process. So step one is that the federal agency, and when we talk about the federal agency, in the case of this project, it'll be the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, because we'll need permits. So the federal agency has to determine the undertaking. What is the project? What is it that they need to approve or in some cases fund? You have to identify the State Historic Preservation Office, and other parties. And when we talk about other parties, we'll talk about consulting parties. That's a Section 106 term. Consulting parties have a very strict definition by regulation, that they're individuals or organizations with a demonstrated legal, economic, or historic preservation interest in an undertaking which has the potential to affect historic properties. Okay, so it has a very specific term, a specific meaning, that term in the 106 process. So those interested individuals or organizations have to express interest in being a consulting party, and that request has to be approved officially. It's not an automatic. Again, it falls back to the definition that's defined in the regulations. Additionally, this is the point where we start to solicit opinions and kind of have a game plan on how we're going to collect comments from the public as well. Step two, identifying historic properties. This is really when we determine if we're doing a project that's going to potentially affect historic properties. We want to determine something called an APE. That's an area of potential effect. And really, that's the area in which whatever the action is, the undertaking, what that area is defined as is related to whatever the action is or what the approval is. In this case, it'll be the permit areas, because that's the federal action. So that's that geographic area that'll be defined. We also, and during this step, we review and we identify existing inventories of historic properties, as well as identify other properties that maybe haven't been evaluated for historic value previously. So what are historic properties? It doesn't necessarily mean just because they're old, they're necessarily historic by definition under the Section 106 process. So it falls back to the National Register of Historic Places. Okay, this is an official list, and when we talk about historic properties, they can be buildings, they can be historic districts, they can be sites, they can be structures, and they can be objects as well. I'm told to go this way. Okay, so this is different things. It can be properties, it could be districts, it could be objects, structures like bridges, or other things that aren't buildings. It's overseen by the National Park Service. Okay, they're who maintains and reviews these things. And it's important to note, and we'll talk about what the criteria are for the National Register, but it's important to know that even if it's not listed in the National Register of Historic Places, if it's eligible, it's looked at the same as if it's actually listed. That's an important point with the Section 106 process. So the National Register of Historic Places eligibility, kind of a running joke a lot of times, if you're over 50 years old, you could be historic. That's kind of the case, kind of the rule of thumb. There are exceptions to that. If it's something very significant, it doesn't have to meet that 50-year criteria. But there also has to meet a significance under one of these defined criteria. So it goes A through D. A is associated with events that have made a significant contribution to history. B is associated with a person or in the past or a group of people. C is a lot of times we'll look at like architecture or some sort of engineering, something that was designed by a master of some sort. And criterion D, a lot of times these are archaeology sites that has yielded or may be likely to yield information important in history or prehistory. So you can have a site that can have more than one criterion, but you have to have at least one of these to make it eligible for the National Register. So in this area, for what we're talking about here tonight, these are the known listed National Register properties. We have the historic district. We have the B&O Railroad Station, you can see pictured here. Important to note with the B&O Railroad Station, it's also a national historic landmark, so that's even a higher importance as well, which means that the Advisory Council gets involved in that as a consulting party. As well, we have the U.S. Route 40 milestones. Each of those milestones is considered an object, and it's listed on the National Register. So we have those as well. Just to give you a little background, some of you are probably already very familiar with this. The historic district was officially approved and put on the register September 31st, 1978. Criterion A, B, and C applied to it as far as it was a 19th century well-preserved mill town, important with the industry and transportation development. It was associated with the Ellicott family, and Criterion C, it has, the collection of buildings, and again, I talked about the architectural style is important a lot of times with Criterion C, and that is the case here as well. The map on the right was the boundary as it was delineated for the historic district in 1978. And again, the period of significance is noted here as 1772 to 1950. So here's just a couple pictures of town, and you definitely can see why it meets the criterion. Step 3, we need to assess our adverse effects. We'll see whether there are adverse effects when we have a project. So there's a criterion we look at. We look at, and it specifically here, is defined here. An adverse effect may occur when, this is right out of regulation, an undertaking may alter directly or indirectly any of the characteristic of a historic property that may qualify the protection for inclusion in the National Register in a manner that would diminish the integrity of the property's location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feel, or association. A lot of times we go back to, why was it even considered eligible for the National Register when we look at whether there's an adverse effect or not. So when we assess the fact it's either adverse or not adverse. And again, the State Historic Preservation Office and consulting parties have an opportunity to review and comment. The last step, if we did have adverse effects, we need to resolve them. Okay, this is where minimization, mitigation comes into play. And again, consulting parties are part of this, the State Historic Preservation are part of this, an agreement is drafted and prepared. So this, with the executed, the signed agreement, ends the Section 106 process. So one little plug here, consulting parties, if you have an interest in becoming a consulting party, we have a contact name with the county, with Beth Burgess. And again, you know, we need to have a justification to why you qualify as a consulting party. And if you're part of an organization, it's good to only have one person represent the organization. That can be a little confusing otherwise. So next steps, we're going to consult with the Maryland Historic Trust, seek input from the public and consulting parties, and as we go along, identify minimization options and mitigation measures. Yeah, that's it.
Thank you very much. Good news, we're a little ahead of schedule, and since we are, I just want to make sure if there's a couple questions for our friends, Chris and Virginia from McCormick and Taylor, about the two presentations you saw earlier, feel free to raise your hand and we can try to get through a couple of questions that you have for them.
Scientifically speaking,
Yeah, please.
scientifically speaking, which storm was worse? Because I kind of feel like you're talking out of two sides of your mouth right now with this data.
It's an interesting question, and the answer would be it depends what part of the community you lived in, because the two storms are very different. But I would also say this, because I know that that's a question that's come up, and it's a question that we've talked about in the office as well, because again, you know, storms are not finite points. They vary in different parts of the watershed. No two storms are alike. For the purpose of the exercise that we've gone through in order to determine the best way forward for Ellicott City, we tried not to get too hung up on the which storm is worse question, if only because when you look ahead at what we are trying to prevent in the future, we don't know what that next storm will be like. We don't know what part of the watershed it'll be centered on, whether it'll have one peak or two or three, whether it'll come from an extended tropical event. So although the water nerd in me would love to, and actually has dissected the data from both these storms quite a bit and looked at that, I think it's important to focus on, we create a benchmark to use and compare the different alternatives such that we can see comparatively which ones improve more so. Because again, whether one storm might have been more intense in the New Cut and another more intense in the Hudson, whatever storm we get in the future is not going to discriminate if we were to design to one type of storm or another. It's important that we have a benchmark that establishes the difference between each of them. And for that, as you've seen, we choose the July 2016 event. You know, again, it's not a representation that that was necessarily a worse storm or a less worse storm. It's simply the benchmark that we've chosen in order to compare the different alternatives.
Next question.
I'm trying to get clear in my head the options based on your overview. And I'm wondering, as you pulled away some of the options, the channels and the tunnels and so forth, is there an option that includes all of the above, the tunnels as well as the Lot D mitigation stuff and everything as well?
The options that are currently on the table are the 5 that are listed in terms of the combinations. As the technical consultant, I can't speak directly as to whether those will always be the only 5 options or whether there's room for other options. I could let the county address that, but for right now, the 5 options presented tonight are the 5 options that are being considered.
Right here, please.
I have a quick question on whether this presentation is going to be available either hard copy or online.
I would presume online.
Okay.
Yes.
What size tunnels are you talking about?
Well, we've modeled different sizes. We've looked at different things. The current options include a 15-foot on the north and a 10-foot on the south.
15-foot diameter?
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
Just for clarity, it seemed to me that both of the plans still left about 3 feet, 4 feet of water in the lower side of Main Street for shop owners down on that end and for residents and so forth. Is that your ideal forecast? And how much rain was that based on? That basically, if you were to stand at the train station and look at the markers for all the historic floods that go up almost as high as the trestle, Are there stages built into this that would allow additional relief to be implemented later as the development is occurring?
It's important to note, relative to particularly the historic floods that you see on that train trestle, that most of those were actually associated with the Patapsco River backing up into Ellicott City. And as we touched on in previous presentations, unfortunately, these last two storms, which are top-down storms within the watershed, the improvements are designed to address top-down storms. If the Patapsco were to flood again from an Agnes-like event, then we could expect that water to back up in the similar way that it did in 1972 and many of those earlier historic storms. And many of the areas that you see are still showing 2 to 3 feet of water even with these improvements. A couple of things to note there. One, it's very challenging to get those elevations completely down because that is a very flat area that goes through. And again, with what we're doing with the twin 10-foot culverts under Maryland Avenue, as well as the tunnels, that is still a tremendous bottleneck in the watershed at that point. It's also worth noting that through the areas that still see some roadway flooding, that also coincides with the areas that if a Patapsco event were to back up, those would still be impacted. So flood-proofing at those lower 1 to 3 foot elevations, in addition to what we're talking about today, is really the best approach to protect those properties from both sides.
Thanks. Regarding Section 106, are there any expedited procedures in situations that are time-sensitive like ours?
What was that? Could you repeat the first part of that?
Are there any expedited procedures for
expedited.
Section 106?
As far as expedited, we still have to follow the process. There are ways to move the process along a little faster. I think we've done a good job already talking about some minimization, so that's going to be helpful. I know there's already been some talk that I've heard that's been in meetings about some mitigation type measures and things that that could be done. Usually that's the biggest holdup a lot of times in the Section 106 process, is figuring out what the mitigation is. So I think it's good if some of that's starting to be talked about so that it can keep moving. As far as expedited in this case, it could be streamlined a little bit and work more efficiently. I think that's the game plan moving forward.
Yes, I have a question. If, from what I understand, do I understand correctly that all your facilities and culverts are sized for 200-year storm in this analysis?
To be honest, most of the improvements that we designed were designed to be as big as we could fit them in the constraints of Ellicott City. For example, the Maryland Avenue culverts are designed with the constraints of how wide across that channel in that area can we get the opening of the culvert to be, knowing that it has to go underneath the B&O Museum property, and there's a certain amount of vertical clearance that allows us to do that. Many of the ponds are designed in such a way that they fit within the terrain and maximize that area as much as possible. So although our model results that you see today are based on the July 16 event, and we've also modeled them for the 2018 event, as well as the typical 100-year storm, the reality is within the difficult constraints, we've designed everything to be really as big as we can fit it, because I think that's the right approach.
If I understand correctly, you said that there are constraints. What if we have a storm which is 4 times, 10 times, whatever bigger that whatever the capacity of ponds and culverts is? So what do you think what will happen as far as the amount of water on Main Street and public safety issue? And another thing is, would it be helpful just to add to analysis, and I believe it is very easy exercise just to add the table plug in different frequency storms, for example, twice more than your analysis and so on, and just see the numbers, how each model will react. So what is your estimate?
Well, it's important to note the thing about flooding and addressing flood problems, and many of you have probably heard me say this before, that a flood problem is not binary. It is not a we fixed it, we didn't fix it. It is really a matter of reducing probability and risk. There can always be a bigger storm event. I mean, there is a theoretical limit to it, but these storm events could have been worse. And also, we will likely see storm events that aren't as bad as the last two that will greatly benefit ones that would have flooded Main Street and say they're 25, 50-year events, that these improvements will render those completely non-destructive. I mean, we focus on that benchmark of 2016, but the reality is, this is all about probabilities. We're trying to reduce the risk as much as possible. We're trying to lower the probability of that type of damage and loss of life occurring again. But we can't plan for every possible scenario that's theoretically possible. I know, we have, particularly with, we've seen with the way the climate has gone the last 30 years, we saw what happened down in Texas, where they had a storm, a tropical storm down there that no one could have imagined. It went off the charts of what would have been predicted meteorologically. So things are on the table. What we can't plan for, we can only hope to be effective in reducing probabilities.
We unfortunately got to get moving, and of course, thank you very much for your presentations. Craig and Virginia, our friends at McCormick and Taylor will definitely be available here. If you have questions for them, they will happily answer. Just to update, I want to acknowledge Councilmember Liz Walsh, who joined us. Thank you so much, Councilmember. As well as Vicky Garcia, who's here representing Representative Sarbanes' office. Thank you, Congressman Sarbanes' office, for your representation. I'm going to announce the breakout sessions, but first, if anyone here needs help with hearing impaired, our wonderful folks who are up front, please come up front, and we will make sure that you can have assistance going around the breakout sessions. So now we're going to go to the breakout sessions, and I'm going to point out where each breakout session is, and please make yourself around each one. The first station is our flood mitigation plans, and that session's right behind that pillar, right behind the wall there. The second one is the high ground access, and the high ground access station is over here to my left, to your right. The third station is the buildings, and the buildings are along the front glass wall when you walked in here to the cafeteria. And the final station is the master plan, which is right there in the alcove that you can find. So please make your way to these stations. Again, grab any of our folks that are available, ask questions, and wait for my voice to call you back for our general Q&A comment section. So thank you so much for this. And please let us know if you have any questions. We do hope the breakout sessions were interesting and many of your questions were answered. But this is a general question and answer period. So have a whole army of experts in front of you that can, I think, answer your questions across the broad spectrum of government. So anyone who would like to be the first person. Now, as a reminder, and I don't mean to be rude or you'll see me sort of nudging or lurking, but we're going to try to keep under 2 minutes to every question so we can get to as many people as possible. So please, on behalf of your neighbors, under 2 minutes. Thank you so much. Who would like to begin? There we go.
So according to the 2016 McCormick-Taylor, it shows about half the water comes down New Cut. And of the plan and the mitigation, it's primarily on the Hudson. And the tunnel option that's proposed, you've got a 15-foot and a 10-foot diameter. The 10-foot's on the New Cut. Did you explore a 15-foot diameter for New Cut? And I think that it needs to be a priority for the south tunnel, because that's where the majority of the volume comes down to Lower Main and causes the damage. Under 2 minutes.
That was different sizes for both of the tunnels. Multiple sizes for both tunnel options, including a 15-foot option, were part of the iterations that were done as part of the study, yes. I do want to note another thing, too, relative to, you had said about half the water coming through the New Cut. It's important to remember, too, that when citing the improvements, that happen in the Hudson, whether they be stormwater or conveyance, have a benefit to all of the part of the community that's upstream of the Hudson, the area around the brewery in Lapalapa, the West End, and those areas as well. The improvements in the New Cut watershed have a benefit to Lower Main Street, but don't help as much on the upper end. So when we improve we reduce the hydrology coming down through the Tiber Hudson, we give the channel below the New Cut more capacity for that water from the New Cut. So there's a benefit across the board there where we can manage the New Cut flow not only in the New Cut watershed, but just providing more capacity in the overall channel by managing in the other two watersheds as well. So it's not as cut and dried as looking at simply the amount of water that comes in from each watershed, but there's more than one way to approach the issue of just trying to get all that water into the channel and through the town.
Go ahead, sir.
Yes, hi, I'm Barry Gibson. I've been in town for 35 years, and I've seen a lot. And one of the things that's somewhat bothering me right now is the transparency of all these proposals. First off, I don't see how it's going to be paid for. I mean, you're talking the number fifth proposal is $180 million. So I need to know how this is going to be funded. Is it going to be public or private? What is it going to be? And the buildings that you're leaving, they're going to be billboards. You're going to put people or pop-up shops in these buildings. It's a little difficult for me as a business person to rationalize what these proposals are. So I know the moratorium was set up so that basically there was supposed to be some analytics taken so we could address certain developments that were being that are coming out around us right now. They're coming right at us, and no one in this room has said anything about developments. And developments scare me, especially so close to Ellicott City. And got an extension now on moratorium, and I just need to know how this is going to be funded. Maybe Dr. Bell can answer that one for me. That's the only thing I got to say, really. Thank you very much. Sure.
So yes, you're right. We are looking to extend the moratorium. I want to thank Councilmember Walsh for taking the lead in that and working with council colleagues and my office. And I think you're right. We do need to take the development that's happened thus far and the development in the future very seriously. And so we are definitely changing how we were doing things, a decade or so ago when it comes to development. When it comes to the funding, I think you're right. The good thing is this is a multi-year process. There are several projects in place, and all of our state and federal partners, from the governor to our Congress members to our state U.S. senators. As soon as I got in office, they all were like, how can I help? What can we do? And even in the last few months, we've already been, because of the help of our state delegation and Department of Housing and Community Development and other entities, gotten several $1 million, and we will continue to get more. Thank you.
My name's Andy Funk. I had an office on Main Street that was destroyed both floods, and we unfortunately moved to Catonsville. I just couldn't, in good conscience, put my staff at risk for being there. We were right behind EC Pops. So my question is about safety. The proposal to remove a third of the back of the buildings right on the riverside, I'm not sure, I'm sure everyone here is smarter than me in this terms, but how does that make those buildings any safer? It seems like if Kaplan's is already pretty wide and then you take a portion of that off the back, it's going to be a pretty skinny facade that's sitting there. It doesn't seem like that would withstand the water that would be coming down. And then also, I echo Barry's sentiment that those buildings are going to sit empty unless there's a plan that we don't know about. But why in anyone's right mind would they move into a building that was already potentially proposed to be torn down and then still sitting there? It just seems like, I'm not sure, you know, Shoemaker's is a beautiful building, but it's not historic. And a lot of those buildings are going to sit empty, and I'm not sure the thought behind keeping the other 6 buildings in place, and also primarily about the safety.
So I'm Zach Hollenbeck with the Bureau of Facilities Design and Construction, working on the building side of things. So the space that's left at Kaplan's will be approximately 20 feet deep, and that, you know, could be enough for a small storefront. In terms of the safety and how we're going to manage that side, that's, you know, something that we're going to work on developing as this plan goes on. You know, how we work to, say, flood-proof the rear of the buildings in order to keep the water in the stream channels. Dr. Ball has made it clear that the buildings will remain in the county's possession and in the public realm until all of the mitigation options have been implemented. For what they become in the near term, I think that's something we still need to work on, but continue to progress that. We're taking some other steps to try to stabilize them as quickly as we can, in Kaplan specifically. We're taking some steps to clean the facades up and restore them as best we can in the near term to try to make the facades a little more aesthetically pleasing in the near term.
Those buildings are not historic. I'm just curious, what was the point of keeping those additional 6 buildings if a beautiful waterway that's even safer would attract more people to the downtown area?
So I know that there is a lot of controversy and not everybody agrees. I personally think that there are lots of reasons why people come to Ellicott City, why they come to Main Street. And I think part of that is the character and the culture. And I think when people come from not just around the state of Maryland or even the region, but from around the world to visit Ellicott City, I want to retain as much of it as possible while keeping it as safe as possible. And I think what we've heard is that we can maximize safety and keep a lot of the historic cultural elements there. Now, it's not just a matter of which ones have been registered historic in my eyes, it's how much of Ellicott City can we retain and still keep us safer.
Hi, I have another question about the New Cut branch, specifically the retention pond NC3. I noticed it is the most cost-effective retention pond for 63 acre-feet of retention for $5 million, and I'm really curious why it was left off Plan 3F5. 3F5 is the plan that best addresses West End flooding, and that was something that affected me heavily last May. And I really like the plan, but New Cut Branch I feel has to be addressed, and that pond seems to be the only major project in that watershed and doesn't seem to be comparably expensive. So is there any particular reason it was left off that plan?
I think of the plans that were presented, you know, there are several. You want to? Okay.
No, if you want to finish.
You can tell a team.
Just, you know, it's important to note, I mean, these are different combinations and permutations. The plan, the F plan had several underground facilities, which were very effective, provided a lot of volume storage. They tend to be more costly than some of the above-ground facilities are. So, you know, that was looked at as a trade-off because you're getting more management in that watershed, which creates more capacity in the lower part of the watershed for the fact that we're not managing in New Cut. Right? New Cut 3 is an effective pond for that sub-watershed, but it wasn't included in every option. Just there's different combinations, which is important for, you know, the choice of people who want to see, you know, what different things can be accomplished based on impact, based on cost, and everyone has different priorities. So
I don't have too much more to add. But I wanted to say that, because I was looking at it today, and if you were to, and I wish we had the chart here where you could see it, But we started with the, what we called option 16C, and we did so many, and that was the 5-year plan. So we started there. That was kind of like the baseline. And it wasn't in the 5-year plan either. And so we were building progressively off of the 5-year plan. So we added underground structures. The next permutation was to add the underground structures to the 5-year plan. And then we saw what impacts that had on the watershed and on the west end. And then the next one we ran, we included NC3, but we took the underground structures at the westmost end, we took them out. And so we could see what the differential piece was. And so then from that point on, we started moving forward and included NC3 and all the other permutations or iterations. And so it was just the way that we built off of the first plan, and with the idea that I mentioned before, I think the context is, one of the things we were trying to do and leave in place was the buildings, and to try and get the volume of water, the water elevation down, and the water elevation primarily down as low as we could get it on the lower main. So it was just really just playing around with, and that's maybe too cavalier of a term, saying play around, but it was just, let's put this in. This is a major component, all this underground structure. Let's see what it can do. And I think that Chris did hit on a point, is that when you look at it objectively, and I know that there are some people that they know, they've experienced it themselves, that they've seen a lot of water, this in particular in this 2018 storm, and I don't doubt that at all. So there was, and an NC3 pond would help some of that. But if you were just to just dive down in the weeds and kind of look at it, if you took the T where the new cut hits the Tiber, and you just took a point there. Now, you could take the water off of the Tiber, upstream of the Tiber, or you could take the water off the new cut. So if you want to reduce the amount of water that flows down the rest of Main Street, behind the buildings that need to remain, you could take that water away from either one of those two stream reaches. And so, with that in mind, too, it was like, well, let's see how much we could take off the Hudson, right, before we start to look at the new cut. And so that's really how it progressed. That's a really long answer for a short question.
Have you considered using, flood protection for each individual building and in conjunction with the entire tunnel system as a whole, just, I guess, to protect from the debris coming down the river or down Main Street?
So I think we have. I think that what we have in terms of realizing that debris is a major issue. I mean, you look at Court Avenue. In fact, I was talking to someone who has a building, owns a building there, and we know, because we met each other there a lot, looking at the dumpsters and the two cars and the trees, and there was even some gas line that was still on the spool that came down and wedged itself in that culvert. So we know that, and that's not the only place, but that seemed like the only place that NBC set up on to do their morning shot at 7 o'clock. So we know that debris is a real big part of why Main Street floods, or we even have localized flooding in other areas, even if it's not on Main Street or Frederick Avenue, but even up in other areas. So we need to be able to deal with it. So there's a couple of things that we started to do, and the first thing is, well, if we keep the channel relatively free of all debris on a high frequency, then we won't, the baseline debris that's floating in the stream, well, we've already taken all that out. And that's the That's what we started to do with the Safe and Sound program was we, once it rains over a certain amount or the winds are sustained over a certain amount, we have to go back out there and clean it up. That's the first thing. The second thing is that most of the major projects that we planned, like even Ellicott Mills, the culvert at Ellicott Mills, we're planning debris catchers, or they're called debris gates. They're going to be placed upstream so that they would catch the majority of the trees that come down. Because during a storm, you could have the stream channel clear. And I think the Hudson was pretty clear, if I remember correctly, because we had just done our quarterly pass through there when the storm occurred. You can have, like, all bets are off during a storm. Trees can fall down that you didn't think would fall down, debris, sediments, all kinds of stuff. Cars can get in there from unknown places. So they get in the stream, they can still clog it up. So the debris catchers are going to help a great deal. Plus, we put bollards around the streams in Lot D. We put bollards around the dumpsters so that it would take a lot to lift them up, a lot of water to lift them up and get them to turn over and go into the stream. So I think there's been a lot there. And the last thing, is the floodproofing grant that we put out. We just finished and awarded 36 out of 40 applicants. And that was a great program, and we hope to continue that in another round. But I think that being able to flood-proof, look at your properties and get the doors that you need, or get the windows, or modify your windows. There were some great proposals that came in. And I think that it's an excellent program. And so that's another thing that I think we're doing is the flood-proofing.
Thanks, Mark. And just a reminder, we're now down to lightning round because we're going to have to start wrapping up to be able to get out of the high school before we can. Joel, please go as quick as you can.
Back in September, I wrote what I call an alternative plan, which basically tried to preserve the facades and put in a flood wall from Kaplan's down to either T and the Tiber or Great Plains, because that would keep the water off of Main Street from that area, and do what Louisville did with preserving their facades. Also, you could put a wall that nobody talks about on the Tiber Alley to protect those buildings. And then to engineer a way of slowing the water and the debris to have it slower, what can't get under the Tiber and the Maryland culverts, to slowly go out onto Main Street, to protect the end of the Phoenix with some floodproofing or barricades or something. Because the Phoenix, I don't support removing, because it's the one building that's working. Most of it's at an elevation doesn't flood. It preserves the streetscape. It protects the B&O. And I don't find how the 40 feet difference between that and going to Maryland Avenue is that's significantly different. Perhaps even that I've yet to see any plans of how what you think the culverts are going to look like at the entrance point. And until you engineer that and figure out how that works in with the proposed park previously, that I couldn't understand how you'd have a park with these huge tunnels there, and keep the cars from Maryland Avenue from going in, and keep the cars from hitting the B&O. All the plans that put the Phoenix with the buildings that are gutted, it doesn't make sense. And the further problem, talking about this flattening out of the street, is the problem of how the water is being trapped by the wall at the railroad bridge, the Jersey barricade, and the bridge itself, to how to engineer some release points there, like a grate in the bridge from the state.
Right, so let me break it down. So the first thing is we do have a design for the Maryland Avenue culvert. It's not a complete design. I don't call it that. Call it a preliminary design, a concept design, where we at least know enough that we could submit to CSX and start to have conversations with them. The other thing is, I think we did analyze the wall, Joel, if I'm not mistaken, and the effectiveness, the effectiveness wasn't there compared to some of the other projects. The third thing is having to take down the four buildings. And I think from a construction point of view, it's going to be necessary to do, because the way that we intend to do the Maryland Avenue culverts will probably rely on like a jack and bore method. And so we'll need that area to put in those pipes. And those pipes are extremely important too. to the lower end, because there's only one place that all that water goes today, and it goes under the Maryland Avenue culvert that exists today, under the Phoenix, the front part of the Phoenix, and then over to, it has to get between the bridge arches and get out. So I think that any secondary method to get water out of town, especially at the lower end, is very, very important. And do you have another question?
Yeah, we have a lot of landlords in Ellicott City that rent out commercial businesses on the first floor, deep in the floodplain. And the history is that the businesses get gutted, the small business owner that was in there renting may be able to get by one way or other, just leaves and they rent it to someone else. Meanwhile, we have technologies, floodproofing, and the money you mentioned, I know it's appreciated, but it doesn't go very far. I know what the costs are. In the residential rental market, the landlords have certain regulations they have to meet to rent out something as a residence wherever in the county. We need something like that for floodproofing where we know it's going to flood badly. And the history we know goes flooding from the Patapsco River up or flash floods down to the beginning of Ellicott City hundreds of years. Okay, my bad. So why don't we do something to upgrade the regulations so we don't have the situation where the small business owners lose in a situation we know is going to happen when there's technologies that can be brought in, prevent torrents of water going through the buildings, and possibly save lives this way besides property value.
Okay, thank you. So the good points, and I can tell you that from seeing the floodproofing grant applications come back, there have been some really great ideas that I think will really help. Some of them are extremely simplistic, but they just allow the property owners to get back in and essentially, squeegee it down and then put, the contents back in. And I think that as a store owner, as a renter, I guess, really you would be most concerned about your inventory, and there might be people here who could talk to you about that loss, that type of loss, and trying to get back up on your feet. But there are some, we've seen some very good techniques that we'll share with other people that have come through for waterproofing. They do use some innovative technologies of materials that are available today. And as far as regulatory regulations, like building code regulations, I think that what's out there, and we do have someone here from License and Permits, if you want to say anything, but I think that the regulations, they're good the way that they are. A lot of people, when they're floodproofing, they are moving units up on the roof, they're moving outlets to much higher elevations, they're moving their electrical boxes up, and I do understand that, this grant was $150,000, and I'm sure that, it could have been, twice, three times that amount. So I think that we are moving in the right direction. There are things that, people can do, and there will be some lessons learned that come out of this first grant application, and we'll share them.
All right, this is the last question, then we all got to get out of here. I'm going to end up in the principal's office, so please.
Oh, goody, you get to end with me. I actually have a non-water, non-building damage related question. My question has to do with, have you all studied the economic impact to the existing businesses on Main Street with each of these plans? I've seen a brief mention somewhere in all of this of potential road closures, but I'm curious as to whether or not it's been discussed what each of these plans means to the businesses that are open and operating. Are we talking road closures? We're talking about construction. I mean, obviously, this is some potential massive disruption to businesses that are still trying to get back on their feet.
Well, I'm not equipped to answer that one.
I can speak to the building work, Julia. So we've been for all the building demolition work, we've stipulated that the road cannot be closed, and that does seem feasible at this point, that we may have to shift the lanes of traffic, and we may have to lose a shoulder on one side temporarily, maintenance of traffic. But in order to do the building demolition work, specifically, we don't need to shut down the road. We may need to alternate lanes from time to time, that sort of thing, but it would remain open to traffic, both pedestrian and vehicular.
And so I think that's a really good question, and even to broaden it, what will be the impact, not just to the businesses, but to the residents, to the town, to the people who go through? And I think as we work through actually engineering and phasing these things out and figuring out who will do various aspects, we'll have a better sense of the timeline, like the specific timeline. Right now we have general timelines, the specific timeline, the flow of which projects will happen when. I mean, for example, we just had road open up just in time for Springfest. And if you had asked us 6 months ago when that was going to open up, we probably would have extended it a month or two. So I think as we're working through things, we will be doing everything humanly possible to minimize the impact and make sure that everyone is viable and successful moving forward. So I'm sorry we have to head out, but I just wanted to first of all thank you all for coming out, for your interest. Many of you, this is one of many meetings that you've been to, and you've stayed engaged, you care about our town. I want to thank everybody here. Many of these people who work with the county started working early this morning, and they worked all day, and they've been working nonstop to do all they can. Thank you. We're going to get through this together. I committed to you that Ellicott City will not be just known for floods. We're going to be known for resilience, for coming together, and be a national model for addressing all of these issues and changing climate. Thank you so much, and drive safe.